Hello, welcome back to the second half of today's lecture, where we're going to be looking at science in kind of everyday life and why it's important to learn and understand life. And really, the reason that I think science is so important to learn for everybody really is that it's a stepwise method of thinking, right? You observe, you hypothesize, you experiment, you analyze, and then you revise. And that's kind of like the idealized thought process of science. And you make sure that you are able to test the conclusions that you're drawing. And if you can't, then maybe you reevaluate the questions that you're asking so that they can be testable. And so, scientific literacy, according to the textbook, is a scientifically or is an individual who is educated, consumer, who can participate in the discussions about important issues. And if you read this, you can understand or you can see a real bias here, right? The scientific literacy, informed individuals who can speak intelligently about issues, or in a way that's informed. So there's a real degree of intellectual hubris in this definition. I would prefer a definition of scientific literacy, which is someone who is able to think critically for themselves and analyze the findings of scientists and determine on their own whether they're acceptable or not, right? So scientific literacy would be the ability to question intelligently what science is being what is being produced and called science. That's what I would define as scientific literacy. But again, because this is what will be on the test, go with this. Now, ethics, when it comes to science, is an interesting topic, and it's a set of moral principles or values. And if that sounds vague to you, well, that's because it is vague, right? There's nothing in science except for the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm in medical industries, that is inherently ethical. There's nothing in the study of science, in the process of science, that has anything to do with ethics. And so a lot of times, if you've collected data and you have an outlier, well, the obvious thing to do with that outlier is delete it, because that ruins your trend. And if you just delete the one outlier, then you have a perfect trend, you publish your paper, nobody double checks you, and your research gets published, and that's just no problem, right? Ideally, you would go back and focus another 10 years on that one outlier that you discovered, but it's a lot easier to just delete the outlier, publish the trend, and move on with life. And why do I say that? Not only because it happens, but because what is ethical is a very fluid term, right? Ethics and science, where do you derive ethics from exactly? It's a great question. What is ethical? Is cutting puppies' throats, their vocal cords, and letting them get eaten by sand fleas to test the effectiveness of a sand flea repellent an ethical thing to do? It sounds pretty awful to me, but there have been scientists who have done those kinds of experiments. It seems very unethical to me. Is it ethical to change the human genetic code? It's being done. I don't know. Is it ethical? How do you define what is ethical, what is not ethical, right? How exactly are you going to make that assertion from a purely scientific perspective? As far as I can tell, when you look into nature, you can justify just about any behavior that you want to. You can call just about anything you do ethical if you look at nature as your example, right? You can find some example of some organism or animal that does just about every horrific thing that you can imagine. And so if nature is our teacher of ethics, then, well, anything goes, really. So this question of ethics, I'm going to leave it and put it aside, and hopefully you and your philosophy teacher can have conversations about this, because how we define what is right, wrong, good, evil, ethical, unethical, well, it defines a whole lot, and it really defines how trustworthy a scientist is. You know, how do they define what is ethical research, right? It's a great question. And if they don't have a definition of ethics, how can they be held accountable when they started with no ethics to begin with, right? If the only goal is to make money, then telling people that cigarettes don't cause cancer, I mean, that's ethical. I don't think it was very ethical, but there were companies who funded scientists to do research that showed that there was no link between smoking cigarettes and cancer. It was a real thing that happened. It was very unethical, in my opinion. But they had scientists who were willing to do it. They must have thought it was in some part, some way ethical. So, again, how ethical science is and how trustworthy science is, you know, your scientific literacy, depends greatly on philosophical pre-assumptions and a lot about the people doing the science. And the reality is, we don't know most of the people doing science. We know a very small sampling of people doing science. Um, we may have met a handful of scientists in our lives. We have one relative who is a scientist. Maybe we have a dozen relatives who are scientists. Are they representative of the whole? Maybe, maybe not. Are the ones on TV pushing certain types of therapies or medicines representative of the whole? Probably not. How do we know? Well, we don't actually know. And that's a good part of scientific literacy, is thinking about the average human being, but smarter. Are they going to be more ethical, less ethical, or have the same ethics but a better mind to justify what they want to do? It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that the smarter a person is, the better able they are to justify whatever it is they want to do. That doesn't necessarily make them more ethical to be more intelligent. So, something to think and chew on. A little bit of philosophy of science here. We'll keep going. Now, developing critical thinking skills more than anything else is one of the goals that I want for you in this class. Why did I just spend a whole bunch of time talking about scientific literacy, critical thinking skills, and in the previous lecture, questioning whether or not the scientific establishment has bias in it? Because I want you to think critically. Seriously, I want you to think critically about science and about everything else, because human motivations don't change just because you study biology, just because you study physics. All of those very human motivations remain the same: power, fame, authority, money, family. All of those priorities, they're all the same. And all of the same weaknesses, the willingness to lie, cheat, steal, um, they don't vanish miraculously just because you have a PhD in science, right? So develop some critical thinking so that people in authority who use science as a cudgel to get you to do what they want you to do, you can think critically and decide for yourself, wow, is this really something that I think is actually viable for me? Do these people actually have my best interests in heart? Do the people who created these social media platforms actually create them with my mental health and well-being in mind? Did the people who tested whether or not cell signals will cause tumors or cancer do so to the extent that they should have because they actually care about me? Or did they prioritize money over safety? How would you know? How would you know? Right? This is critical thinking, and it needs to be thought about science as well. And so, question, 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 right? I said one of the things that a great scientist does is question, and great scientists question themselves, their results, and other scientists. And I want you to be great scientists, whether or not you go into science. Now, evaluating promotional materials. This is a great way to use science in everyday life that most people don't do. I'll give you an example. You get prescribed a medication from a doctor, and it has a list of side effects. Half the time, the side effects are worse than the disease it's trying to cure. I've actually seen this in medicines that it actually, in some cases, causes the symptom that it's trying to prevent. Um, so, like a heartburn medication, I saw one of the possible side effects was a heartburn. And so you got to think to yourself, you got to think critically, you have to evaluate whether or not this is going to be useful to you or not. And you have to find reliable, trustworthy sources, right? Not every doctor you go to is going to have your actual health and well-being at heart. Some doctors are just trying to get you out so that they can be less overwhelmed. That's a human motivation. Some doctors get money if they prescribe certain medications, and so they have a vested interest in prescribing a certain medication for a certain problem. It doesn't mean it's the cheapest. It doesn't mean that it'll help you the most. It means that they will get a little bonus if they give you this new medication that they want to become popular. Sorry. So, again, critical thinking, evaluating things in a way that is not just naive and trusting, but has a degree of reserved skepticism, I guess would be the best way to put it, right? What are the motives of the science? What are the motives of the doctor? The political figurehead on the news who happens to be a scientist, who's in a public office, who is trying to get you to do something. What are his motives? Are they motivated by an investment that he made in a pharmaceutical company? Or are they motivated by a genuine desire for the health and well being of the populace? These are great questions to ask. And if you're not asking them, you should ask yourself why. Why are you not asking these questions? So, back to the thought focus question, what are the characteristics of scientific inquiry? Well, I've given you quite a few, and I'll let you answer this question on your own a little bit later, but hopefully, scientific inquiry begins with observation, goes through experimentation and evaluation of results, and is very, very self critical and self skeptical when it comes to the conclusions that it draws. That would be an ideal kind of answer to this question for me, but I'll let you answer it for yourself because I want you to think for yourself, which would be a very good outcome. All right, that's today's class. I've got questions and assignments. Thank you for listening.